Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for these cover crop webinars that are presented by the OMAFRA soil team with our partners, Soils at Guelph, Grain Farmers of Ontario, and the Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association. This is a three-part webinar series, and this first part is all about maximizing manure. We'll have a session on weeds and on forages next week. Some thanks in order to start. Thank you to Spear Seeds for sponsoring this session. Thanks also to our panelists, but we'll get to them in a bit. Just some quick housekeeping to let you know how this is going to work. We'll have some presentations to start with from our panelists, but really what these webinars are all about is the discussion that comes out afterwards. So everyone's got their mics muted now, but please feel free once we get into the discussion to unmute and participate there. That's what makes these worth attending and worth listening to. You can participate by raising your hand in the Zoom, by asking a question in the chat or answering a question, including a comment. And if anybody is dialing in from a phone, you might not be able to see those other things. So I guess just shout at us and we'll include you there. This session is also being recorded so that we can post it later for those who aren't able to attend. So just so that you are aware, it is being recorded. And before we get to our panelists, we'd like to know a bit about our audience. Jake, you want to launch that poll? I can't actually see the poll, so hoping it's going.
It is going.
Great. So while you're answering that question, I'll start with our panelists. Today we're joined by Dan Breen, who's a dairy farmer from Putnam near Woodstock, past winner of the Soil Champion Award, and Dan works with cover crops and manure on his farm and will share us his perspective and experience. We've also got Adrian Guntensperger, who is also from a dairy farm near Seaforth and does some custom application also. So he sees a lot of ground and some different perspectives as well. And finally, we have Christine Brown, field crop sustainability specialist, affectionately known as Manure Girl or Queen of the Pile. Chris knows a lot about manure and can tell us everything that she's seen in her illustrious career, and will help us sort of wrap things up before we get to the discussion. So without further ado, Dan.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. As Sebastian said there, I'm a dairy farmer from Putnam. I took over the farm from my parents in 1989 with 20 cows and 100 acres. And over the years, we've tried to grow both the dairy herd and the cropping side. We started out conventional tillage, and I realized that my dad's machinery was wore out, and we decided to take a different approach, and we started no-tilling. My first no-till crop was in 1989. I soon realized that was just part of the bigger picture. We incorporated cover crops, and all in a desire to enhance the natural systems by mimicking Mother Nature. And so with zero tillage and manure applications, where do you put that? Well, we found it's best to put it on a living crop. We're not limited to that. We can put manure just about anywhere that the ground is fit. We have spread manure in the spring before planting, after planting, after wheat, after fall crops. We'll stockpile dry manure and let it compost and spread in the spring, or spread in stockpile through the summer and spread in the fall. But I believe manure is like a probiotic for the soil. I think it's key. Some of these pictures you see going through here are of our family, of our barn, but today's focus is on maximizing manure and cover crops. So this particular slide you see right here, that was triticale, peas, barley planted after wheat, and it was such a wet fall, and we really didn't need to feed, so we just left it. And we thought, well, what are we going to do with this mat come spring? But as the next slide will show, 3 coulters per row on the planter, turned into a wonderful strip. And you can see it at planting, you can see it at emergence, and then you can see the picture, the last picture of the crop in the fall. Manure application for us is all about timing, and compaction is your worst enemy because it squeezes all the air and water out of the soil particles. And when you're no-tilling, that's a disaster. So when conditions support spreading is when we spread. This is a picture of us spreading solid manure in the spring on a rye cover crop that's planted in the fall. We also have liquid manure that can be spread with a tank. I prefer a drag hose, but some fields we tank too. And once again, we have spread before planting of a cover crop, on a cover crop, and the soil has huge capacity for holding nutrients, holding moisture. We build manure tanks or manure storages, but really the greatest storage we have out there is our soils, if we apply them in the right time and in the right way. By going first, I have to start with my own thoughts and can't follow up on anybody else's, but soil is a living resource. It's not a resource like a gravel pit. It's alive, it's well, it's something that needs to be managed. So this picture shows radishes coming up through wheat stubble at different stages of growth within that same year. This particular field, the next slide will show the custom applicator couldn't get there, so we planted the radishes first, and then he came and applied, what did we put on there? 5,000 gallons of liquid pig manure after the radishes were up. And I was concerned we'd burn and damage them, but it was very successful. And even if you did get slight leaf burn, that grew right out of it and took right off. We don't have enough manure to cover all our ground with our dairy herd, so we get as much manure as we can. We trade corn for pig manure, and well, actually we sell about 100+ acres of corn every year to a pig farmer, and then we get his manure back. We pay for the custom app. We've spread poultry manure, we've spread horse manure from a horse stable, from the racetrack, cow manure, anything I can do to get my hands on manure. As I said, I believe it's a probiotic for the soil biology because it's a living organism. I compare my soil to the rumen of my cow. It needs feed, it needs to live, it needs to be active. And if I don't have enough food for them, then I'm basically starving them out. So another comparison is we store feed to feed the cows through the winter. So I like my soils to go into the fall with enough organic matter, enough living roots, and enough nutrients to keep them active, keep them growing. Then obviously, if you've got cover crops on top, it's going to prevent erosion and wind erosion and things like that. Typically, my rotation is corn, beans, and wheat. We have alfalfa for the cows as well, and we try to have. I don't like monoculture in cropping. I don't like monoculture in manure application. I think each manure is slightly different, so we try to mix that up. Radishes are a brassica, which is it's not a legume, it's not a grass, it's something different as well. I've never had any success. I'm not saying people don't, and I'm not saying you shouldn't, but I personally have never had any success with interseeding. So I typically will harvest one crop and plant another crop. So there's our liquid manure spreader. This was from this spring. That was soybeans that we harvested late last fall. Felt it was too late to put wheat in, and so then we planted rye and then spread liquid cow manure on it this spring. Then the next slide, okay, the field to the right, or the picture to the right, unharvested rye after soybeans. That's the very field. So we spread liquid manure on it, terminated it a week later, and then planted corn into it a week after that. We have row cleaners on our corn planter, and it just moves enough trash to get some black dirt for germination. The middle picture is a field of oats and peas we planted after wheat. for cattle feed that was harvested, but then the oats regrew, and then that was terminated this spring. And then the very first picture is a field of radishes, and you can see it was a dry winter, dry spring. You can still see the remnants of the actual radish tuber, and you can see the hole in the soil there. So those are the three conditions we planted into this spring. Either the radish residue, the peas and oats, or the unharvested rye. I love rye. You can plant it really late into the year and it'll still keep growing. And I wasn't watching my clock, and I apologize. I really think I'm out of time. I'll let someone else speak and we can have questions after. We'll just flip through these last few pictures. There's drag hosing on standing radishes. There's the dates we did it. Now this particular picture you see was last summer. The lagoon was too dry to pump, so we added 200,000 gallons of pig manure to 200,000 gallons of cow manure and mixed it together, and then spread that at a rate of 5,000 gallons an acre, and very successful. Okay, next slide.
Next slide takes us to Adrian.
Yeah, there you go.
Adrian, go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Adrian Guntensperger. I run a custom dry manure application business out of Seaforth, cover basically most of southern Ontario all along Lake Huron. I grew up on a dairy farm, so our family farm, we have 200 cows and crop just shy of 400 acres. And I do the custom application and I manage all of my family's land. So we have about 4 years ago, we switched to cover crops and strip till. So we are all strip till corn, no-till soybeans, and a little bit of tillage ahead of new seeding alfalfa. So, and if you go to the next slide, so we try to apply 90% of our manure into a growing crop. So between corn and alfalfa, that pretty much is where most of our liquid goes. So we will put 8,000 to 9,000 gallons on hay fields over 2 to 3 cuts. So if we have enough, we'll put on after 3 cuts. If we don't, we'll put between 3,500 and 4,000 gallons on hay fields after first and third cut. And after second cut, we'll put some elemental sulfur with a little bit of potash as a carrier, just to top up our sulfur if we need it. Our further away hay fields, we truck the manure to instead of tanking it, just to reduce compaction and to get that manure on more timely. So yeah, all our corn is strip till, so we're in our 4th year now. When we first started, we sprayed everything. We terminated before planting, which worked well. And then last year, because the rye was planted so late, you see in the picture on the left, we wanted a little bit more growth. So we went ahead and planted it and then terminated about 7 days after planting, which worked really well. But don't let the rye get too big. That's what I can say about that. And then the field on the right is alfalfa terminated in the spring, strip tilled, and then planted corn. Next slide. So what we do, and this is our 3rd year doing it now, when corn is emerged and you can row it, we basically just drag hose the field with 4,500 gallons at that time. So that same field will have received 4,500 gallons in April when the rye was green, basically at green up. So yeah, there will be, between 2 applications, we'll have 9,000 gallons of dairy manure on our corn ground. So you do see some damage to the corn, but because corn is so small, it recovers. Once corn is knee high, you never see it. So we've had good luck doing this. We figure that our nitrogen savings pays for 1 application of manure. Next slide. So this shows basically 4 pictures at different timings. So your top left is when they're applying it, And then the bottom, that's about a week to 2 after. So you do see the tracks where they drove. The corn's about a leaf behind. But then if you look at the bottom right picture, you can't see any tracks anymore. You still have some plant variability, but I think that the benefit is far greater than the damage. So so your top right, so on a cornfield like that, so we would typically put on, so we have 4,500 gallons April, 4,500 after emergence, and then we'll come back and side dress between 12 and 15 gallons of 28 with Y drops and the 40 pounds of N that went in the strip. So we're only putting about 80 pounds of N down as commercial fertilizer, and the rest comes out of the manure. We had one field last year coming out alfalfa, which we never side dressed. We put 40 pounds of N in the strip and the 9,000 gallons of dairy manure, and we soil sampled it, and there was lots of nitrogen there, and we never applied any, and that was our best field of corn last year. Next slide. So after corn silage, we no-till all our cereal rye cover crop basically as soon as it's off. If the field's going to soybeans, we no-till in the cereal rye, and then we spread 5 tons an acre of dry manure after it's planted. So if you look at the top middle picture, that's after it's planted and spread. And then we planted that at 100 pounds per acre because we harvested that for feed. So the bottom left picture shows it after emergence. So as you can see, there's no tire tracks. So with the inflation systems on our dry spreaders, and if, as Dan said earlier, the ground conditions have to be right? So that was dry when we did it, and you see no tracks, even though it was spread after it was planted. And then the top right is just a picture of the rye when we cut it this spring. If you go to the next picture. And then, so after we harvested that rye, we no-tilled in the soybeans, as you can see in the top left picture. Soil moisture was an issue this year. They had to plant it fairly deep, so the beans were slow to come up. So we're still dry to this day. Soybeans are all there, plants are all there. They're a little slow, but I'm hoping with the rain we're gonna get, we should be okay there. So this is our first year doing this, and so far looks positive. We get a crop of feed off it and hoping for a full crop of soybeans. If you look in the middle picture, the soil structure, even though it's dry, I didn't need a spade to pull. I just pulled the roots of the rye out of the ground, and that's what I got. And then the picture on the right is, if we don't need the feed, that's 45 pounds per acre of rye planted and then strip tilled in the spring and planted soybeans into. So those two pictures are from last year. That's the best soybeans we've ever grew. That was 70 bushel beans. So next picture. So because I do like with custom work, I see a lot of different operations. Everybody has a different way of managing dry manure, cover crops, and even spreading in crop. So I have a number of customers, especially sheep and goat customers, which don't have liquid, where we spread dry penpack on hay fields at 4 to 5 tons per acre. We have done more, but then it gets to be questionable. But nobody has ever had an issue with manure in their feed. So we've had really good luck with that, and it works extremely well. And then I have a number of customers where we spread in cover crops. If you look at the top right picture, that was in September. That was, I believe it was oats, an oat mix of sorts, which we spread, I think it was 4 tons per acre of poultry on, and then they strip tilled that directly behind us. and then it was terminated later in the fall. And I have several customers which after wheat, we spread 3 to 4 tons per acre of poultry manure. Ahead of us spreading, they broadcast oats on, and then they run the ripper through and incorporate the manure and the cover crops in one pass. So, and it's straight oats. Their thinking is keep the cover crop cheap and effective. And if you go back to those fields about 3 weeks to a month later, they're completely green with a mat of oats. And then they just terminate in the fall. And in the spring, they'll do 1 cultivator pass and then plant corn. So yeah, so this is this year. This year the rye got bigger on us. And I guess the lesson we learned is you have to terminate the rye sooner than later. If it gets 6 inches, even if it's earlier in the spring, you should terminate it. So if you look at the picture of the strip tiller, this was pretty much perfect soil conditions when we planted it. And then it was terminated, I think, 2 or 3 days after planting. And corn all emerged, but we just, in spots, there was so much rye there. I think it was more of a competition effect, but if you look in the picture on the top left, you can see where the drag hose packed the rye down. The corn is way greener, much further developed, much further ahead. So yeah, I think the lesson here was terminate the rye early. So it's probably the rye is breaking down, tying up the nitrogen. But since that picture now, if you look at that field today, it's still uneven, but it's dark green now. And it is actually looking a lot better than I had expected when I took this picture about 10 days ago. So yeah, that's all I have.
Great, thank you, Adrian. Appreciate that. Chris Brown, your turn. You're muted.
Good afternoon, everyone. Dan and Adrian have provided a lot of information. I think I'll just provide a little bit of a summary on cover crops and their benefits when they get manure. So next slide. Maybe. Perfect. So one of the benefits with adding manure to cover crops is that it really increases the biomass production from the cover crops. I've talked about before that there seems to be a synergy where if you apply just the cover crops, you get benefits to the soil. If you apply manure, you get benefits to the soil. But it seems when you apply manure and cover crops, you get additional benefits with that extra biomass. And that biomass helps with water holding capacity, with adding soil diversity to the microbial population, and it helps with nutrient cycling. Another benefit that we get with some of the cover crops is the nitrogen scavenging. So if some of the studies that were done probably 10 years plus ago, where we looked at how much nitrogen is held in the cover crop and even how much phosphorus and potassium is held in the cover crop, it's quite a bit higher where we add manure compared to where we don't. Some forages or some cover crops are great for emergency forage, and when we add manure to those forages, cover crops for forages, we have both higher yields but also higher quality. Oats that have been harvested for forage and have had manure applied have had, when we put the information into a Wisconsin milk program, have basically doubled the amount of milk production capacity compared to just oats applied without any manure. So that's a pretty good payment on adding manure to that cover crop. Nitrogen scavenging also helps prevent nitrogen loss through leaching or through volatilization in some cases, and also from sometimes nitrous oxide in the spring. Next slide. So you've seen in the slide here that there's almost a 20 to 30% or more increase in biomass production where you've got cover crops with manure versus where you don't. One of the things that we've learned and have seen in quite a few instances, and Adrian alluded to this, is keep it simple, keep the mix simple. Where we added manure to a diverse mix with more than 8 different cover crop species, we found that most of the cover crop was oilseed radish or nitro radish, maybe a little bit of clover, and then rye, cereal rye or oats. And the rest of the species, we really didn't find very many, or you had to look hard to find them. And with the expense of the multi-mixes, where you're adding manure, it's probably better just to reduce the costs and have the simple ones. And turnip for cover crops with manure is another one where you get a lot of good growth. One of the benefits of mixes, keeping the oilseed radish or the nitro radish in lower amounts, tends to reduce some of the potential for getting radish roots in tile, and just that diversity gives a better mix over the field. Next slide. So one of the questions that we get asked a lot is about how to seed cover crops. Should I seed the cover crop first, then put the manure on? Should I put the manure on first, then plant the cover crop? What are some of the options? And so most of you have seen this slide from Michigan on the right-hand side lots of times. It's called slurry seeding. It's where the cover crops are mixed in with the manure and then applied. It's a little bit time-consuming. It's a little bit dangerous, at least from a personal safety perspective. So there's been a lot of work in, are there other options? Adrian talked about broadcasting the seed, then putting the manure on, and the injection units would help to mix in some of the cover crop seed. And that's a good option. Some people are looking to try and put the cover crop seed and the manure on at the same time. So the two pictures on the left-hand side show an air seeder that has tubes that basically blow the seed right in behind where the manure is applied in that injection row. It depends a little bit on what type of machine you've got. If you've got injection units where the manure is going deep, sometimes the cover crop can be seeded too deep and doesn't emerge very well. So it really depends on how is the equipment set up and how deep is the manure being applied. In some cases, that seed will be blown in front of where the manure is applied, in other cases in behind. One of the things with slurry seeding to be careful of is the salt content of the manure. Usually not an issue with dairy manure, but sometimes with hog manure, if the salt finisher hog manure, if the salt content is high, and if the seed sits in the tanker for any period of time, you can get some salt injury in that cover crop. Next slide. So the next couple of slides show the difference in planting date and manure application. So in this case, it was slurry seeded. So the seed was mixed in with the manure. These are slides that were taken in Wisconsin as a part of a demonstration with the Manure Expo. So in this case, the manure and cover crop was planted on August the 1st. And the Manure Expo was in the middle of August, so this was a couple weeks later. Next slide. So in this case, we've got 3 different planting dates. Number 1, the manure was applied before the cover crop planting. So the manure was applied July 26th. The cover crop was planted on August the 1st. And you can see a pretty uniform cover crop. You don't see much track damage or much damage from injection units or any compaction. In number 2, the manure is applied immediately after cover crop planting. So the manure was applied August the 1st, and then the cover crop was planted right after. Again, there's a little bit of track damage, but not bad. Then we've got another one where the manure was applied after cover crop emergence. So the cover crop was planted August the 1st, the manure was applied 2 weeks later. And here you can see a lot more damage. I think one of the things that we've learned with cover crop and manure application is if you're going to apply the manure after the cover crop is planted, it depends a little bit on the species. It depends if we've got clovers or small seeded Facetia, or I can't even pronounce it, Facelia, but some of the other cover crops, you tend to get a little bit more damage than with the cereals. Oats, you tend to not get quite as much damage, but I think with applying the manure into cover crop after the cover crop is emerged, it's sometimes better to wait a little bit longer. So next slide. So some people will wait until later in the season. So this is anaerobic digestate that's applied into a red clover cover crop with a lot of broadleaf grasses. And it's injected because with digestate, there's a lot of ammonium that gets volatilized because of the high pH. So injection is recommended. And you can see in this case, it was middle of October. So the cover crop is already grown. The debate is if I can apply that manure a little bit earlier so that the cover crop gets benefit from the nitrogen that I'm applying, that's great. And so if I could have applied this at the beginning of September or the end of August when the wheat was harvested in mid-July, I would have had enough growth. I probably wouldn't have gotten a lot of damage. Next slide. In this slide, it's showing a dribble bar that's applying the manure underneath the canopy of a red clover crop. This was done again in about the middle of October. If it had been done a little bit earlier, that would have been great. And depending on what the cover crop is, obviously the red clover doesn't get the same benefit from the nitrogen that an oat cover crop would. Oat cover crop without nitrogen, if you're trying to harvest it for feed, would get some pretty significant rust. So nitrogen and some fungicide often will make the quality better. But the nitrogen perspective, you get a huge benefit from that manure. The other thing to consider with applying manure after the cover crop has been established or has emerged is what is the width of the application equipment. If I've got something that's not very wide, if I'm applying manure using a box spreader and I've got 10-foot intervals between application widths, I'm going to do a lot more damage than if I've got a machine like this where I've got a 60-foot application width, or if I've got vertical beater spreader where I've got 60 feet or 45 feet or whatever for application width. So I think that makes a big difference in how much compaction damage or how much damage you're going to see to that cover crop. Next slide.
So that actually takes us to the end of the presentations. So thank you, Chris, thank you, Adrian, and thank you, Dan. For those of you who joined us a bit later, if that was because you got the link late, then sorry about that. Our administrative person taking care of that was getting vaccinated because it's 2021. So thanks for your patience. And if you want to go back and see any presentations you missed, this is being recorded and we'll have it up on YouTube, so you won't actually miss anything. But now we get to the meat of what we're all here for. We have on the line in our panelists, we've got experience and expertise. So now's the time to ask any questions you have, whether you've done something already, tried something and want to know how to tweak it, or are thinking of trying something and want to hear from our panelists how they might guide you so that you don't have to make all the same mistakes that they do or did. Or if you've got your own system, your own way of doing things and you want to share, then please go ahead. We've got a question already from, I think that's Bob Thurwall. Are there any issues applying dry manure after planting cover crops or just with liquid injection?
I'll take that one. In my experience, we haven't had any issues. If your spreaders are getting the particle size small enough and you're getting a consistent coverage, and that's probably the key. You know, if you're dumping on 10, 15 tons per acre, you know, behind a box spreader that's not set up properly, then you could probably run into issues. But if you have the small particle size and you're covering the field evenly, then you should have no problem getting the cover crop to come up through that dry manure.
I agree with Adrian exactly with that. We've had the picture, one picture show was the old box spreader, and that was rye we were going to terminate in a week or two anyway. But if we want to spread dry manure on a living crop and hope that it will continue to live, we will rent a vertical beater spreader, and as you said, get the particle size fine, and hopefully do it when there's some rain in the forecast, to kind of help move it in and whatnot. So yes, couldn't agree more.
Yeah, and I would concur with that as well. If you've got Penpack manure and it's coming out chunky, that's going to suffocate the cover crop. What some people have done in that case is they've taken Penpack manure, they have taken it to the field and put it through the spreader and let it compost naturally for a while, and then in a month or two, that naturally composting has made it a lot more like that silage quality, that's smaller particle size and much more uniform in spreading.
Yes, Christine, I couldn't agree more with that. That as a rule of thumb, we never spread, you know, the day we take it out of the pen. Like, we like to pile it and let it start to break down. Yes.
So I have several customers that we do where we literally take it directly out of their barn, put it in the spreader, and spread it on the field. And I would have no issues putting that on a cover crop or a living crop. So our spreaders will size it down enough to not cause any issues.
Does that depend on the type of bedding, Adrian, or more on your equipment?
I think the equipment is the biggest thing, but I would say if it's heavy cornstalk bedded or really long straw, that is where you might run into an issue. But if they're using chopped straw, or, you know, some of these packs we do them twice a year, right? So the bottom half of the pack is so decomposed that it spreads no different than if you're loading it up out of the pile.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We have another question here from Karen Thompson, and this one might be for you, Chris, but Dan and Adrian, if you've done any nitrogen testing, feel free to jump in. Karen wonders if there are any data or trends that you've seen with respect to residual soil nitrogen or subsequent cash crop yields based on the timing of manure application. So whether that's pre or post cover crop emergence, or anywhere after or before that.
That's a really good question. There is data that shows significant residual nitrogen in the soil where you've got cover crops. And I had a slide on that, but my computer crashed, so I'll have to find it again. But a significant nitrogen in both the plant and in the soil compared to where there was no cover crop or nitrogen applied. The yield following cash crop, I'm assuming you mean the year after, trying to get a nitrogen credit from the cover crops with manure added is a little bit more difficult to put an exact number on. We found that the cover crop releases its nitrogen sometimes not at the time that you're hoping to have the corn crop use it. So if you've got, for example, oilseed radish and you've put manure on it, you tend to get that nitrogen release maybe more in line with when the wheat crop needs it, but by the time that the corn crop needs it, it's not there. If you've got oats that has gone to head or close to head and there's significant cellulose and lignin, tend to not get that nitrogen released from the cover crop in time. It's there, it comes later. So red clover is still the crop that releases the nitrogen closest, and it doesn't seem to matter if you've had manure applied or not. It might be a little bit of difference, but we don't seem to get that increase in the cover crop. And Anne Verhollen would have some more to add to this because she's done some of the same work with vegetable crops.
And feel free to jump in if you'd like, or anyone else. This is the time when you can unmic. That's what you'd like to do.
I had this conversation with my agronomist, and we talked about if you have regular manure applications with cover crops every year, you're always releasing some organic nitrogen, right? Because sometimes the manure from this application might not be there right away, but the stuff you put on earlier in the spring or last fall, you know, it's breaking down, right? So if, let's say, like our corn ground, for example, right? Sometimes it gets a little bit in the fall, we have too much, but let's say the 4,500 in April and the 4,500 gallons in late May, early June, right? So that first application might already be releasing nitrogen in June, whereas the second application takes time to break down. So then it's releasing in, let's say, August when the corn needs it, right? And then our 40 pounds in the strip is there. Yeah. So I think it's a balance of everything. That's my personal opinion. Maybe Dan can add to that.
I think that's true. And when it's spring applied manure, I think it really depends on what type of manure you're working with. If you're working with a dairy manure where you've got 50% ammonium nitrogen, 50% organic nitrogen, and a significant amount of bedding, that release is going to be slower than if it's finisher manure or pig manure, where you've got probably 2/3 to 3/4 of the nitrogen is as ammonium. Where it's applied in the fall, yeah, the manure makes a difference. And where it's applied regularly, definitely a difference. We did nitrogen sampling this spring on a field that had manure applied last fall, regular alfalfa in the rotation, and there was way more nitrogen there than like there was no extra need for nitrogen for that corn crop. But where manure doesn't get applied every year, the results aren't quite as consistent.
Okay, so it depends, but if it's part of the system, you're building up that soil nitrogen, and then very likely there will be some. Several of you have sort of touched on this a little bit. Andy is asking, what's your opinion of applying liquid hog manure into a living corn crop, and what stage of corn is best? And Adrian, I know you do this, you have some experience with this. How late are you comfortable driving over that corn? And does it have anything to do with your tires or PSI? Share we.
Yeah, so we do dairy. I don't have any experience with the liquid hog, but I think we try to get in there basically as soon as you can row it. I think the earlier the better from a crop damage, but I know Christine, they have done research on this, and they say we can go up to V4 growth stage and the corn will come back. So yeah, I would say anywhere between 1 and 4 leaf, whatever you're comfortable with. So and from tire standpoint, you know, low tire pressures, nothing changes there, you know, whether you're in crop or on any field, it's still, you know, lower tire pressure will do less compaction. And the wider your boom, right? If you can spread 60 feet over 40, that's less tire tracks going across the corn. So that's less corn plants that are going to be a leaf behind, right? The only thing I would say is in the corners, it's where it's double applied. That's where you really see it, you know, when they get too much on in a corner with the drag hose, then you see the plants really struggling to come through that. And Dan might have more to add to that. You know, he does hog manure.
The only experience I have, the question was more specific about putting it on a corn crop. I've never spread it on a corn crop. It's always a cover crop. So you're right. In the corners, liquid pig manure can be hotter. That's why if like this year we we mixed it with the cow manure just out of necessity, but I think that might be a safer way to go. It kind of dilutes it, kind of gets the nitrogen to bind with the fiber in the cow manure. And if it's on a cover crop and you do have a bit of damage in a corner or whatever, it's not quite as a big an issue. But I wanted to comment on the previous question about the timing, and Christine mentioned regular applied manure, and everything that you can do through cover crops and manure and whatnot to build that healthy soil, like a healthy athlete or a healthy immune system. If we can do everything we can to provide the environment where the soil can thrive and be healthy, it provides a resilience. It can adapt to stresses. It can, and you said, Adrian, about the slow release of nutrients throughout the whole growing season. I think really the strategy in all of this is to build healthy, strong, resilient soils, rather than trying to pinpoint the magic moment or the magic amount or place or anything else. I think if you can just and farming is a lifetime commitment. If you can get in and build it and get it healthy and resilient, then I think that's the key to success, and it'll pay back. I wish there was some kind of way to quantify it. And Christine, I know you spent most of your life trying to do that, quantify the value of what these things are in a dollar aspect, but it's just a long-term investment that pays in huge dividends, and I can't emphasize that enough.
I would agree with Dan. Just sorry to add to that. Once your soil, if you can build your soil up and have good soil structure, good soil health, it's more forgiving. So we've planted into some questionable conditions. Our custom guy was really concerned. It was, alfalfa burned off in the spring. They could only get the strip tiller maybe 1.5 inches, pushing 2 inches in the ground. They were struggling with the root balls. And I said, it's alfalfa ground, just plant it and it'll be fine. And they were really concerned about it. And that was our best corn that year. So if your soil structure and health is there, it's more forgiving.
There was a bit of a follow-up from Andy, and that's he's asking about what about applying that hog manure for emergence for corn, that is. Chris, any problem with salt or ammonia burn?
Christine would be the one, but yeah, if you there's no tissue to burn, and you'd have to have an awful lot to actually burn the seed or the developing roots. So I would think, it would be fine before emergence. But Christine, that's your field, I think.
I think it depends a little bit on how it's applied. If you're injecting it and you're concentrating even 5,000 gallons in an 8-inch band, and if it's between the rows, fine. But if it's hitting some of the corn, you could get some damage. I have seen that before. And liquid hog manure is fairly high in salt. So is poultry manure. But if it's mostly when it's applied at high rates. The same with the question before about applying it into standing corn. With drag hose, you're limited to about the 4-leaf stage without damaging the population. But if you're going in with a tanker, you can go right into 8-leaf stage, depending on how the application equipment is set up. You've got some equipment now, like the fancy drag hose systems by I can't remember what the company's called, just the Cadmans, where they can go right into corn up to 8-10 leaf stage without doing any kind of damage. With a tanker, the hard part is being able to get to the end of the row without running out of manure ahead of time. And that's a little bit of a, how do you get the rate right? The other thing I just want to mention is we should never plan to apply all the nitrogen as manure. It's always good to have some nitrogen up front, just because we don't know always what the weather conditions are going to be and how we know that the nitrogen from manure will become available, but will that amount of nitrogen be there when the corn has its highest needs? And so it's good to have some nitrogen there from commercial sources as well. And at the same time, that way we're not over applying phosphorus and building up our phosphorus levels too much. where manure is being applied on a regular basis. But as far as pre-emergence, it all depends on how it's set up, and if it's between the rows, that shouldn't be a problem.
Just want to add to Andy's question. I think bag hosing, and we've never done it, we try not to get in there before corn's emerged. I think if you're going to do it after planting, you should do it like days after. I think that where you drive over the corn rows, if you got that shoot coming up, if you break that shoot, that corn will never come back, right? But once it's up, it'll recover from that. But yeah, if you break that shoot, then you'll lose all the plants where you're driving across the rows. So that, we've never done it because that's what I'm afraid of. But yeah, I don't know anybody who's ever tried it like that. But I guess to add to that, we had one customer where we spread dry manure on corn no-tilled into cereal rye after they had chopped it this past, I think last week in May we did it. And you can see any tire tracks, but that was no-tilled. And yeah, you couldn't see where we drove over the corn rows with the dry spreader. And I just looked at that field a week ago, so.
The nice thing about planting your corn on time and applying the manure afterwards is it gives you an opportunity to reduce the compaction, and you still get the corn planted at the time where you're going to improve your yield opportunity the most, and it usually gives you an opportunity of 4 to 6 weeks to apply that manure, depending on what kind of equipment you've got.
So we have an interesting question here from Rachel. For those of you who have experience with different types of manure, is there any reason other than availability that you would look for a particular type of manure, or liquid versus dry, to address certain soil health issues? So Rachel has mentioned soil erosion, but are there any of those kind of more refined management decisions that you'd try to pick your manure based on? You just take what you can get and spread it.
I have a variety of soil types, Rachel, and some of the heavy clays and light sharp sands and everything in between. If I'm trying to build organic matter, you can use cover crops and get as much biomass as you can. So on sandier soils, you have more opportunity to get in without compaction. So I would lean towards putting liquid manure on a lighter soil with on a living cover crop to build that biomass. Your bedded packs or your straw manures on heavy clays will help open those soils up. Worms eat organic matter, not nutrients. So if you can broadcast some straw or fibrous manure on clay ground, the earthworms will crawl up to get it and pull it into the soil profile. So to answer your question, yes, I would put higher organic matter or straw manure or fibrous manure on clay grounds. And plus, if it is a hilly farm, it'll stay more in place. So I would put those types of manure on heavier ground and liquid manures on lighter grounds. But lighter grounds can leach, so you better have a crop there to hold that in the soil profile. Does that make sense to anybody else on the panel? Or?
Yeah, I would agree with that. But I think the other thing is, if soil erosion is one of the vulnerabilities, having a cover crop there when the risk of erosion is the highest. So in that case, it might be a good opportunity to have a cover crop over winters, like cereal rye, or leaving the oats to die by itself, so that there's some root protection to prevent the manure from being moved. One of the things with manure is you can have your manure types like compost, that the nitrogen is in organic form, and so you don't have risk of volatilization, you don't have risk of leaching, but the phosphorus is still there. And if the phosphorus, if the manure moves and the phosphorus moves with that manure, then you still have potential for environmental consequences.
I'm just sharing here our CEU credit QR code. For those of you who are looking for that, you can, I guess, take a picture of that QR code there, or email Anne to get your credits. It is 3 to 1, where we said we'd end, and it's Friday. It was lunch hour. I hope everyone's been eating, but our panelists probably still need to. Any parting words from any of you, or last questions?
There was one question that didn't get addressed, and that was the one about microbiology in the soil and measuring it and impacts of herbicides and other things. There is more interest in finding out the ratio of bacteria to fungi and some of the other microorganisms. We're not there yet. I think there's still a lot of work to do. But as far as additives like herbicides, I think it's the fungicides that probably have more consequence than herbicides to cover crops and to manure and to soil biology. That's just a really quick answer.
To add to that, Christine, so we deal with some worm pickers too, and I had one of them tell me that basically if Roundup is okay, straight Roundup, as soon as you start spraying other chemistry, he says it shrinks his worm size in half. So there's definitely effect from what he's saying on a soil biology level. Maybe, I'm not sure what the microbiology, but it has an effect on the worms.
Just real quick before people start dropping off, we have Jake has a last poll for us, so that's launching. Dan, any last comments?
Well, I have a couple, and I'll make it quick. One, the question about terminating, when to terminate your cover crop. Some die naturally over with frost, some will live through the winter. Depending on your soil type is how I manage that. Heavy clay soils, if you want it to warm up and dry up in the spring so you can get into plant, you better terminate it in the fall. If it's a light soil that you're afraid of wind erosion or building organic matter, you can leave those growing longer. But I've never tried planting green, but I've watched it, and I'm leaning towards terminating before planting. But back to the comment, depending on your soil type, depending what crop it's going into, whether it's an early planted crop, a later planted crop, that determines termination date for me. And in conclusion of all this, start simple. Start with some oats, start with some rye. Rye is resilient, but we got to feed these soils. And if you look at history, civilizations have fallen and risen based on the quality of their soils. And so let's not be one of those civilizations that depletes our soil, depletes our organic matter, and loses our ability to produce food. So let's keep our soils healthy and alive and thriving.
Awesome. Great note to end on. I'll just mention again that this is the first in a 3-part series, and that next week on Wednesday, same time, we'll be talking about how to manage a cover crop system from a weed control perspective, and on July 6th, talking about how cover crops intersect with forages. So thank you everybody again for joining us. And sorry, that was Tuesday, the next one. We will have recordings available soon. And thanks again to our panelists, Dan Breen, Adrian Guntensperger, and Christine Brown. And with that, have a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you.